December 17th, 1854, Thornhill Plantation. They found the first message at dawn, traced in cold fireplace ashes across the master bedroom floor. 3 names, a date, and a single word that made grown men's hands tremble. By sunset, all 3 named men were dead. The girl who wrote it was 12 years old, couldn't read English, and had been locked in the cellar the entire night before. What happened on Thornhill Plantation between 1852 and 1854 wasn't witchcraft, though that's what they called it in the trial transcripts that were sealed for 140 years. It was something far more disturbing, a systematic campaign of psychological warfare waged by an enslaved child who discovered that the most powerful weapon against her captors wasn't rebellion or escape, but their own guilt made visible in the language of their nightmares. Welcome to Echoes of Truth, where we don't just tell you history's darkest stories, we make you feel the cold sweat that ran down the backs of men who thought they were untouchable. Do you have the courage to hear what really happened in the shadows of America's antebellum South? Subscribe now and comment your location below to join this investigation, because what I'm about to reveal will make you question everything you thought you knew about resistance, prophecy, and the price of looking away. I want you to picture this. South Carolina's low country in 1852, where the air hangs thick and wet even in winter, where Spanish moss drapes from live oaks like funeral shrouds, and where the wealth of Charleston's elite is built on the systematic brutalization of over 400,000 enslaved people. Thornhill Plantation sits 12 miles inland, 3,000 acres of indigo and rice fields that generate $22,000 annually, equivalent to roughly $700,000 in today's currency. The main house rises 3 stories, white-columned and pristine, surrounded by 37 slave cabins arranged in deliberate sightlines so that no movement goes unobserved. At night, the only sounds are cicadas, the distant creak of the water wheel, and sometimes, according to letters preserved in the Charleston Historical Society, the sound of weeping that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The overseer's journals describe an unnatural stillness that would settle over the quarters on certain nights, a silence so complete that even the dogs refused to bark. This wasn't just a plantation, it was a meticulously designed prison where every architectural choice, every sightline, every bell schedule was calculated to break human spirit. And into this manufactured hell, in the autumn of 1849, arrived a 7-year-old girl who would become known only as the Ash Girl in the documents that survive her. Now, you have to understand who we're dealing with here. Colonel Marcus Thornhill wasn't some cartoonish villain. He was a pillar of Charleston society, a deacon at St. Michael's Episcopal Church, a generous donor to the orphanage, a man whose dinner parties were attended by senators and whose opinions on agricultural reform were published in respectable journals. His wife, Catherine, was known for her charity work among deserving poor whites and her exquisite needlepoint that hung in the governor's mansion. Their son, Edmund, was educated at the College of Charleston and spoke 3 languages. These were cultured people, refined people, the kind of family that modern descendants would point to with pride in genealogy forums. But the private letters, the ones that only came to light when a historical preservationist found them hidden behind a false panel in 2018, reveal something else entirely. Marcus wrote to his brother about his experiments in behavioral modification, with clinical detachment, describing enslaved people as subjects and their resistance as fascinating puzzles to solve. Catherine's diary contains passages about her special project children, enslaved girls she selected for what she called refinement training that involved isolation, sensory deprivation, and systematic psychological manipulation designed to create, in her words, perfectly compliant domestic instruments. Edmund, then 19, was tasked with documenting these educational methodologies with the precision of a scientist, sketching diagrams and recording response times like he was dissecting insects. They saw themselves as enlightened masters, innovative even, applying modern scientific principles to what they genuinely believed was the improvement of an inferior race. To anyone who visited Thornhill, and many did because the Thornhills loved entertaining their peers, The plantation operated as a model of what they called benevolent patriarchy. Visitors remarked on how well-fed and orderly the enslaved population appeared, how the cabins were whitewashed and arranged in neat rows, how there was a small infirmary and a Sunday prayer service where enslaved people were taught Bible verses about obedience and heavenly reward for earthly suffering. The Thornhills would give tours, pointing out their innovations in plantation management, a system of small rewards for productivity, separate sleeping quarters for children to protect their innocence, and what Catherine called her finishing program for select young girls who showed aptitude for domestic service. Newspaper accounts from the era praised Colonel Thornhill's humanitarian approach and his Christianizing influence on his workforce. One Charleston Mercury article from 1851 even held up Thornhill as an example of how slavery, properly administered with both firmness and kindness, could be a civilizing institution beneficial to both races. The cover story was so convincing, so carefully maintained, that when neighboring plantation owners experienced resistance or unrest, they would consult Marcus Thornhill for advice on maintaining harmony and discipline without resort to excessive correction. The image was perfect, enlightened masters guiding grateful, simple people toward salvation and productivity. Behind that image, in spaces visitors never saw, something else entirely was unfolding in the darkness. Let's be real. What made Thornhill truly terrifying wasn't the public brutality you'd see on other plantations. It was the invisible architecture of control. Beneath the main house, there was a network of root cellars and storage rooms that officially existed for preserving food and storing wine. But the architectural plans preserved in the county records show something unusual. Reinforced doors with locks on the outside, ventilation systems that could be deliberately closed, and a series of small rooms, each approximately 6 feet by 8 feet, that had no official purpose listed in any inventory. Former slaves interviewed by the WPA Federal Writers Project in the 1930s, elderly then and careful in their testimony, referred to these spaces as the learning rooms or Miss Catherine's schoolhouse, always with a particular tone that the interviewers noted as marked reluctance and visible distress. One woman, Mary Simmons, who had been a child at Thornhill, described seeing girls taken down into these rooms and emerging days or weeks later, changed in their eyes, like something had been taken out and something else put in. The overseer's ledgers show regular purchases of materials that don't align with agricultural needs, unusual quantities of lamp oil, specific types of cloth used for sensory deprivation in medical settings of the era, laudanum well beyond what the infirmary would require, and curious entries for educational materials from a supplier in Charleston who specialized in equipment for insane asylums. There was also a separate building, officially listed as a meditation chapel for the family, which was positioned at the far edge of the property, surrounded by thick vegetation and featured windows that were painted black on the inside. This was where Catherine Thornhill conducted what she called her refinement sessions, and where a 7-year-old girl named Grace, though she'd later be stripped even of that name, would spend hours, sometimes days, in darkness and silence, being systematically broken down so she could be rebuilt according to Catherine's vision. When neighboring plantation owners or the occasional concerned visitor noticed something off, a girl who flinched at sudden movements, children who wouldn't make eye contact, or the unsettling uniformity of behavior among certain domestic servants, the Thornhills had perfectly rational explanations ready. Some children arrive so traumatized by their previous situations, Catherine would explain with practiced sympathy, that it takes special care and patience to help them feel safe again. The isolation rooms, quiet spaces for prayer and reflection, because we've found that spiritual contemplation aids in their moral development. The fact that certain girls seemed unable to speak above a whisper, the result of respiratory ailments common to their constitution. We're treating them with the finest medical care available. When elderly enslaved people mentioned strange occurrences, objects moved inexplicably, messages appearing overnight, the sense of being watched by unseen eyes, the Thornhills would nod knowingly and dismiss it as superstition natural to their limited understanding, or the result of exhaustion playing tricks on simple minds. The medical establishment of the era supported these explanations with their own racist pseudoscience. Dr. Samuel Cartwright, whose work was widely respected, had recently discovered diseases supposedly unique to enslaved people, drapetomania, which caused them to flee captivity, and dysesthesia ethiopica, which made them resistant to work. In this context, any unusual behavior could be medicalized, pathologized, and explained away without ever examining the environment that produced it. If a child exhibited trauma symptoms, she was obviously suffering from constitutional weakness or hereditary deficiency, never from what was being systematically done to her in the darkness beneath the house. The man who made it all possible was Reverend Thomas Ashford, and this is where the story gets truly chilling. Ashford was the Thornhill family chaplain, a respected clergyman who led Sunday services for both the family and the enslaved population, who was present at every significant plantation event, who had the trust of both the masters and, at first, some of the enslaved community. He was 47 years old, educated at Princeton Theological Seminary, and had written papers on what he called pastoral care for persons of African descent that were published in church journals. But his private correspondence, discovered in 2019 when a researcher was cataloging unrelated church archives, reveals his true role. Ashford was Catherine Thornhill's theological justification and Marcus's intellectual co-conspirator. He provided biblical backing for every psychological torture, finding scriptural passages that could be twisted to support isolation, silence, and what they called ego death as paths to salvation. He was present during the refinement sessions, offering prayers that doubled as psychological manipulation, telling terrified children that their suffering was God's love breaking their sinful pride, that their tears were washing away their inherent wickedness. He kept detailed records of each child's progress, noting when their resistance broke, when they stopped crying, when they achieved what he called blessed emptiness, that could then be filled with proper Christian obedience. But here's the worst part. Ashford also served as the intermediary between Thornhill and the outside world, carrying letters to Charleston, speaking at church gatherings, and providing testimony to any curious authorities that everything at Thornhill was not only legal, but morally exemplary. He was the perfect cover, a man of God vouching for the godliness of something unconscionable. Without him, the Thornhill system couldn't have operated in plain sight for so long. The girls Catherine selected for her refinement program fit a specific profile, and understanding this pattern is crucial to understanding what happened next. They were between the ages of 6 and 13, uniformly described as intelligent or quick in the slave sale receipts and trader correspondence. The very trait that made them valuable to Catherine made them targets. They were often sold alone, separated from families, which meant fewer witnesses and less resistance from protective adults. Grace, the girl who would become known as the Ash Girl, arrived at Thornhill in November 1849, purchased at a Charleston auction for $280, a premium price that suggests exceptional qualities. The auction record describes her as approximately 7 years, light duties, house-trained, literate in signs, responsive to command. That phrase, literate in signs, is crucial. Grace had been taught a rudimentary symbol system at her previous location, probably for communication between enslaved people who spoke different languages. She could represent concepts without words, a skill that would later become her weapon. Over the 3 years before the Ash writings began, Catherine cycled through 11 girls in her program. Some were eventually deemed successful and assigned to household service, moving through the house like ghosts, silent and efficient. Others were sold away when they proved resistant to improvement, a phrase that appears repeatedly in Thornhill's business correspondence. 2 died, officially of fever and consumption, though the timing of their deaths, both during extended refinement periods, raises questions that the brief burial records don't answer. Grace witnessed all of this. She survived what broke others, and in that survival, isolated in darkness and silence, She learned to see patterns that her tormentors didn't know they were creating. Daniel Cooper was nobody special, a white carpenter contracted to repair storm damage to the slave quarters in late October 1852. A 31-year-old journeyman from Charleston who needed the work and didn't ask questions about plantation politics. He was supposed to be there for 2 weeks, fixing roofs and replacing rotted boards, sleeping in a room above the carriage house and taking his meals with the overseer. But Cooper had insomnia, a condition he'd developed after his wife died in childbirth the previous year, and on his 4th night at Thornhill, unable to sleep at 3 in the morning, he went walking through the grounds with his pipe. What he saw would change everything. In the pale moonlight filtering through the moss-draped oaks, he witnessed a small figure, a child, he realized, moving between the main house and the slave quarters with an oil lamp, stopping to trace something in the dirt near the kitchen house, then disappearing like smoke into shadows. The next morning, he mentioned it casually to the overseer, expecting a simple explanation, sleepwalking perhaps, or a child sneaking food. Instead, the overseer went pale, made him repeat every detail, and then told him with unmistakable warning in his voice to forget what you saw, keep to your work, and for the love of God, don't mention it to the colonel. That reaction told Cooper everything he needed to know. Whatever was happening here wasn't normal, wasn't sanctioned, and definitely wasn't safe to know about. But curiosity, that dangerous human trait, had already taken hold. Over the next week, Cooper began watching, carefully and quietly. He saw the girl 3 more times, always between midnight and dawn, always moving with purpose, always stopping to draw or write something that would be swept away by morning activity. And then, on November 2nd, 1852, he saw what she was writing, and everything he thought he understood about the world cracked open. Now you have to understand what happened to Daniel Cooper next. He didn't tell anyone directly what he'd seen that night. The names traced in ashes outside the smokehouse, the dates, the symbols that looked like crosses but weren't quite. Instead, he did what seemed rational. He copied them down in his work journal, planning to quietly leave Thornhill, finish his contract, and forget the whole unsettling business. But the next morning, November 3rd, the plantation erupted in chaos. One of the names Cooper had seen written in ashes, Thomas Whitfield, a neighboring plantation owner who'd been visiting the previous evening, was found dead in his guest room, apparently of a stroke, though he was only 42 and had been in perfect health at dinner. The second name, Samuel Hicks, the plantation's head overseer, collapsed while inspecting the rice fields that afternoon and died before a doctor could be summoned. The third name wasn't a person, but a place, the North Barn. That night, it burned to the ground despite there being no lightning, no obvious source of ignition, and a crew of enslaved men who swore they'd checked every lamp and extinguished every fire before locking up. Cooper wanted to run. He packed his tools, prepared to forfeit his remaining pay, and leave immediately. But Colonel Thornhill summoned him to the main house that evening, sat him down in the study with a glass of very expensive brandy, and explained with frightening calmness that terrible coincidences sometimes occurred, that the girl in question was mentally deficient and prone to night wandering due to her condition, that the ashes were meaningless scribbles she'd been making for weeks, and that any suggestion otherwise would be seen as disruptive superstition that could damage Cooper's reputation and future employment prospects throughout the Charleston area. The message was clear. Accept Tut. He official explanation, or be destroyed. Cooper accepted. He finished his contract. He left Thornhill on November 12th, and for 6 months, he tried desperately to convince himself that what he'd witnessed was indeed coincidence, that the terror he'd seen in Colonel Thornhill's eyes had been imagination, that the feeling of being watched by a 12-year-old girl who never spoke had been paranoia. The other girls from Catherine's refinement program were living evidence of what had been done in those underground rooms, though no one with power chose to see them as such. They moved through the plantation house like shadows, efficient, silent, and fundamentally broken in ways that made visitors uncomfortable without quite knowing why. Martha, who had been refined 2 years before Grace arrived, worked as Catherine's personal maid and never spoke above a whisper. never made eye contact, and flinched visibly when anyone moved too quickly near her. Sarah, refined in 1850, served at family dinners with mechanical precision, but had developed a nervous habit of scratching her forearms until they bled, always in the same spot, always when no one was directly watching. Elizabeth, sold away in early 1852 after being deemed incomplete, had lost the ability to show any facial expression at all, a condition that a visiting doctor noted as peculiar in one so young, suggestive of severe neurological insult. But Grace was different. Grace had gone through the same darkness, the same silence, the same systematic psychological dismantling. But something in her hadn't broken. It had transformed. The other girls had been emptied. Grace had filled her emptiness with something else. Enslaved adults who survived into the 1930s and spoke carefully to WPA interviewers remembered her as not quite there and looking through you at something else. One woman, Susan Parks, described Grace's eyes as old, too old, like she'd seen past the end of things and come back knowing. Another, Richard Morse, who'd been a field hand at Thornhill, said he'd seen Grace standing perfectly still in the middle of the quarters at night, not moving, not blinking, just seeing things the rest of us couldn't see, and then she'd go write them down in ashes or dust or whatever was at hand. This wasn't madness, though many chose to see it that way. This was a child who'd been systematically isolated, sensory deprived, and psychologically manipulated into a heightened state of observation and pattern recognition, and who'd found a way to weaponize what had been done to her. Let's be real about what Catherine Thornhill was actually doing in those underground rooms, because the surviving documentation, hidden in her personal papers and only fully analyzed in the last decade, reveals something chillingly methodical. This wasn't random cruelty. It was systematic psychological experimentation based on contemporary theories about sensory manipulation and behavioral conditioning. Catherine had corresponded with doctors who ran private asylums, with experimental psychologists in Europe, with practitioners of what was then called moral treatment for the insane. Her methodology followed a specific protocol. First, complete sensory isolation in the dark rooms for periods ranging from 3 days to 2 weeks, with minimal food and water, no human contact except for brief instruction periods. This was designed to break down the child's existing sense of self and reality. Second, introduction of controlled stimuli, specific sounds, touches, scents, paired with Catherine's voice delivering theological instruction about worthlessness, sin, and the need for absolute obedience. Classical conditioning applied to human souls. Third, gradual rebuilding, where compliant behavior was rewarded with light, food, gentle touch, creating desperate attachment to the captor. Textbook psychological manipulation that predated our modern understanding of Stockholm Syndrome by decades. The records show Grace went through this cycle 4 times between ages 7 and 9, each cycle lasting longer than the last. But here's what Catherine didn't anticipate. In that profound darkness and silence, Grace's mind didn't just break, it adapted. She learned to track time by her heartbeat and breathing. She memorized every sound, every footstep pattern, every routine of the household above her. She developed what modern psychology would recognize as hypervigilance combined with extraordinary pattern recognition abilities, and most crucially, in the silence, she learned to predict behavior based on the smallest clues, a tone of voice, a hesitation, a repeated phrase, developing an almost preternatural ability to forecast what people would do before they did it. Catherine thought she was creating a perfectly obedient servant. Instead, she created someone who could read the secret language of guilt, fear, and imminent disaster written in human behavior. Let me introduce you to someone who doesn't appear in any official Thornhill documents, someone whose name was only recorded because he eventually testified at a trial that was later sealed. Isaiah Freeman, a 46-year-old enslaved blacksmith who had been at Thornhill for 12 years and had earned the privilege of hiring out his time on Sundays, keeping a small portion of his earnings with the impossible dream of someday buying his freedom. Isaiah was nobody's idea of a hero. He kept his head down, did his work, and survived by being useful enough to be valued but not so visible as to be noticed. He had a wife, Rachel, who worked in the kitchen house, and 3 children who'd been sold away years before, a loss that had carved something permanent out of him. But Isaiah had something else: literacy. He'd been taught to read by a previous master who'd needed him to understand written instructions for complex ironwork, and he'd carefully hidden this skill at Thornhill, knowing that literacy in an enslaved person was seen as dangerous, punishable, and potentially lethal. He kept a hidden journal, written in tiny script on pages torn from account books he'd salvaged, documenting daily life at the plantation, not for any grand purpose, but simply to preserve evidence that he had existed, that he had thought and felt and mattered. Isaiah noticed Grace. More than that, he noticed what happened around Grace, the pattern of ash writings and subsequent events, the way overseers suddenly avoided certain areas she'd marked, the growing fear in the white staff that they tried to hide behind increasing brutality. And in November 1852, after the deaths and the fire, Isaiah made a decision that would either get him killed or change everything. He was going to document what was really happening, gather proof, and find a way to get that evidence to someone who might care enough to act. Isaiah's investigation was necessarily slow, careful, and terrifyingly dangerous. He couldn't be seen paying unusual attention to Grace or to the patterns he was tracking. He couldn't ask direct questions without raising suspicion. So, he did what enslaved people had always done to survive. He listened. He positioned himself where he could overhear conversations between the white staff. He watched who went where and when. He tracked the ash writings by waking before dawn and memorizing what Grace had written before it was swept away, names, dates, symbols that repeated with specific meanings. And he began to see what Grace was doing. She wasn't prophesying deaths. She was predicting them based on observation. That first trio of deaths in November. Thomas Whitfield had been showing signs of what we'd now recognize as a heart condition: shortness of breath, chest pain he dismissed as indigestion, a grayish pallor that Grace had apparently noticed. Samuel Hicks had been secretly drinking heavily, a habit Grace would have observed during his late-night visits to the liquor storage. The barn fire had been set deliberately by Hicks himself for insurance purposes, a plan Grace had overheard being discussed and known would happen that night. She wasn't supernatural. She was simply seeing what everyone else was too busy or too privileged to notice. But Isaiah also discovered something darker. Grace was now actively using this ability to kill. Not directly, she never touched anyone, but by predicting when someone's reckless behavior would catch up with them and then ensuring that prediction became visible, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of terror. Write a man's name before he dies of his own excess, and suddenly his death seems ordained. Write a location before an accident that was already likely, and the accident seems prophesied. The ash writings were psychological warfare, and then they were working. By February 1853, 2 more overseers had quit. Several enslaved people had been sold away, not as punishment, but because their presence made the Thornhills nervous for reasons they couldn't quite articulate. And Colonel Thornhill himself had begun to unravel, drinking heavily, seeing threats everywhere, and becoming increasingly paranoid that Grace knew something about him that would destroy everything he'd built. Can you handle what comes next? Because this is where the story turns truly chilling, where we move from psychological manipulation into outright murder, from a child's desperate survival mechanism into something that challenged the very foundations of a system built on dehumanization. I want you to understand what you're about to witness. The moment when the powerless discovered a form of power that the powerful couldn't combat, couldn't suppress, and couldn't even fully comprehend. This isn't comfortable history. This isn't a simple story of good versus evil. This is about what happens when systematic torture produces someone who understands the system better than its creators do. If you're still with me, if you're brave enough to follow this investigation to its darkest corners, Then leave a comment right now telling me what you think happened next. Did Grace's predictions become more violent? Did the Thornhills finally move against her? Or did something even more unexpected unfold? Hit that subscribe button, because the next video in this series reveals documents that have never been publicly discussed, testimony that was deliberately sealed to protect powerful families, and evidence that this story is far from unique in the history of American slavery. You think this is the only plantation where this happened? Stay tuned. The truth is darker and wider than you imagine. On March 17, 1853, Isaiah found what he'd been searching for. Undeniable proof of what the Thornhills had been doing and what Grace had become. In the back of the blacksmith shop, behind a loose board where he sometimes hid his journal, Isaiah had created a small cache for important findings, scraps of paper, copied passages, anything that might eventually serve as evidence. That day, while repairing the ironwork on the main house cellar doors, he'd been left alone for 20 minutes when Catherine unexpectedly left to address a kitchen emergency. In those 20 minutes, working with trembling hands and racing heart, Isaiah forced open a locked cabinet in the underground corridor and found Catherine's detailed experimental journals, 3 leather-bound volumes documenting every child who'd gone through her refinement process, complete with before and after assessments, methodological notes, and disturbingly clinical observations about psychological breaking points. The entries about Grace filled 32 pages. They described her initial resistance, her eventual appearance of compliance, and then, this is crucial, Catherine's growing realization that Grace was perhaps too intelligent for the process and had developed an uncanny ability to anticipate events that suggested either genuine prescience or an observation capacity beyond normal human range. The final entry about Grace, dated February 1853, was chilling. The subject has become dangerous. She watches constantly and appears to catalog human weakness with disturbing accuracy. Recommend termination of experiment and removal to institution or sale to Deep South location where her abilities might be less conspicuous. Isaiah also found something else. Catherine's correspondence with a private asylum in North Carolina that specialized in housing difficult cases from wealthy families, people who needed to disappear quietly. The most recent letter, dated March 10th, outlined arrangements for a young female patient of African descent requiring permanent care for dangerous mental aberrations. Grace was going to be buried alive in an asylum where no one would ever hear from her again. Isaiah had maybe a week to act. What happened on the night of March 23, 1853, has been reconstructed from multiple sources: Isaiah's own testimony, statements from other enslaved witnesses, and the frantic letters Colonel Thornhill sent to Charleston authorities in the following days. Isaiah made his move during the Spring Gala, an annual event where the Thornhills entertained 50 guests. A perfect night of distraction when the enslaved staff was stretched thin and security was focused on protecting silver and expensive wines rather than watching one blacksmith and one silent child. At midnight, while the party raged in the main house, Isaiah broke into the cellar, retrieved Catherine's journals from where he'd carefully replaced them, and found Grace in the small room where she was kept at night. What he expected was a traumatized, passive child who'd need to be carried to safety. What he found was a 12-year-old girl who'd been waiting for exactly this moment, who'd already packed a small cloth bundle, who'd already loosened the boards in the back wall, and who looked at him with those ancient eyes and said the first words he'd ever heard her speak. "I know where we have to go. I've seen it." They ran. Through the servant passages, out through the kitchen courtyard, across the gardens and into the pine woods that bordered the western property line. Behind them, within 30 minutes, the alarm was raised. Thornhill organized a hunting party, overseers, neighboring plantation owners, professional slave catchers with dogs, all following the standard protocol for runaways. But Grace had mapped every patrol route, timed every guard's movements, and led Isaiah along a path that avoided every expected checkpoint. They covered 12 miles by dawn, moving through swamps that Grace navigated as if she'd memorized every fallen log and safe crossing. She led them to an abandoned rice mill, a structure too, Pat shouldn't have been standing. That wasn't on any recent map, where two other enslaved people were already waiting, part of an underground network that Grace had somehow identified and contacted without anyone knowing. The pursuit continued for 3 more days, dogs and guns and promises of reward money. But Grace kept them ahead of it, predicting search patterns, knowing when to move and when to stay hidden. It was like she could see the future, witnesses said later. She couldn't. She just learned to read people so accurately that their actions became predictable. She'd survived by becoming what they never expected, smarter than them, more patient than them, and absolutely ruthless in her understanding of how their system worked. On March 28, 1853, Isaiah and Grace reached Charleston, not to hide, but to do something unprecedented that still baffles historians who study this case. They walked directly into the office of Robert Barnwell, a federal magistrate known for his religious convictions and, uniquely for the time, his willingness to occasionally rule against plantation owners in cases of extreme documented abuse. Isaiah presented Catherine Thornhill's journals, his own documentation, and Grace herself, who spoke for the first time to a white authority figure describing in precise detail what had been done to her and the other girls, what she had learned, and what she had become as a result. Barnwell was horrified. He was also politically astute enough to understand that this case could destroy powerful families, that it exposed aspects of slavery that even abolitionists found hard to articulate, and that a 12-year-old enslaved girl who developed an almost supernatural ability to predict human behavior was a deeply uncomfortable figure for everyone involved. The reversal came swiftly. Barnwell issued a temporary protection order and initiated a formal investigation. But within 48 hours, pressure descended from Charleston's elite. The Thornhills were connected to senators, judges, bank presidents, and church leaders. Letters arrived warning Barnwell that pursuing this case would destroy his career, his family's social standing, and possibly his safety. Witnesses began recanting statements. Doctors examined Grace and declared her mentally unsound. Her testimony, the delusions of a fevered mind. The journals, the physical evidence, were confiscated and sealed under a judge's order citing sensitive family medical information that couldn't be made public without violating privacy. Isaiah was arrested for theft of plantation property and briefly jailed. Grace was remanded to see custody pending medical evaluation. The system was closing in, reforming around the wound they'd tried to open, healing itself by crushing them. But Barnwell, to his credit, did one thing that would prove crucial. He made copies of everything before it was confiscated, and he hid those copies with a trusted abolitionist contact who would smuggle them north. The official system had crushed their attempt at justice, but the evidence survived, waiting in darkness for another century before anyone would dare examine it. The raid on Thornhill Plantation didn't happen because of Grace's testimony or Isaiah's evidence, not directly. It happened because on April 3, 1853, 6 days after Grace and Isaiah's failed attempt to expose the truth, something unprecedented occurred that forced Charleston authorities to act despite their desire to bury the entire affair. A group of 12 enslaved women from Thornhill simply walked away in broad daylight, marching down the main road toward Charleston with Grace at their head. And when overseers tried to stop them, Grace spoke loudly enough for 3 white witnesses to hear. "Touch us, and I'll write your names tonight. All of you know what happens then." The overseers backed away. The women kept walking. News spread through Charleston like wildfire. Not the details, but the essential horror of it. A child had somehow seized psychological control of an entire plantation through fear of her predictions. The panic this created among the slaveholding class cannot be overstated. If enslaved people could wield this kind of power through mere reputation and pattern recognition, if terror could flow upward from the powerless to the powerful, the entire system was at risk. So authorities raided Thornhill, officially to restore order and investigate claims of unusual practices. What they found in the underground rooms, even in their heavily redacted official report, was damning. The isolation cells, the restraint equipment, the detailed journals cataloging psychological torture of children. All of it documented with such clinical precision that it couldn't be dismissed as simple plantation discipline. They found medical instruments used for experimental procedures. They found clothing from at least 18 different children, carefully labeled with dates and assessment notes. They found Catherine's correspondence with asylum directors discussing the dispose of subjects who'd proven too resistant or too damaged. And in what was called the meditation chapel, they found walls covered in scratches. Hundreds of desperate fingernail marks where children had tried to claw their way out of darkness, some marks so deep they'd gone through the wood to the brick beneath. The investigating officers, hardened men who'd seen brutality before, were physically ill. One resigned his position within a week. Another, in a letter preserved by his descendants, wrote that he had witnessed hell given architectural form. Now you have to understand who Marcus and Catherine Thornhill really were once the veneer of respectability was stripped away. The investigation, limited as it was by political pressure, revealed a couple whose entire public persona was performance. Marcus Thornhill wasn't a respected agricultural innovator. He was a sadist with a scientific bent who'd been quietly asked to leave 2 previous plantations due to irregularities in how he treated enslaved people, irregularities that were never specified in writing, but were serious enough that wealthy men paid him to go away quietly. His agricultural papers had been largely ghostwritten by others. His reputation was purchased through generous donations and careful social networking. The behavioral experiments he'd conducted weren't innovation. They were torture dressed in the language of progress, motivated not by curiosity but by a need for absolute control that bordered on psychopathology. Catherine was worse in some ways because her cruelty was genuinely ideological. She believed with the fervor of a true fanatic that she was saving the souls of savage children by breaking them completely and rebuilding them as proper Christian servants. Her diaries, the portions that eventually became public, revealed a woman who felt no empathy for her victims, who described their screams as resistance to salvation, who genuinely saw herself as a missionary doing God's work through psychological destruction. She'd had 3 children of her own who died in infancy, a common tragedy of the era, but her response had been to pour all her maternal impulses into perfecting enslaved children, creating a twisted projection of motherhood that turned love into torture. As for Reverend Ashford, he was revealed as a defrocked minister who'd been removed from a previous parish for inappropriate conduct with vulnerable parishioners. That's a euphemism that covered abuse that was never prosecuted. The Thornhills had given him refuge and purpose, and he'd repaid them with theological justification for atrocity. When questioned by investigators, he showed no remorse, only indignation that his ministry was being questioned by lesser men who didn't understand his higher purpose. This is where the story gets truly chilling, because Thornhill wasn't unique. The investigation uncovered correspondence between Catherine Thornhill and at least 47 other plantation owners, asylum directors, and private educators across the American South, the Caribbean, and even Brazil. A network of people experimenting with psychological manipulation, sensory deprivation, and behavioral conditioning on enslaved people, particularly children. They shared methodologies, compared results, and refined techniques through letters that read like scientific papers, but described human suffering with clinical detachment. In Virginia, a plantation called Millbrook had implemented a similar refinement program for young enslaved girls being trained for domestic service in wealthy homes. In Louisiana, a sugar plantation owner had developed what he called compliance training that involved isolation, religious indoctrination, and systematic reward and punishment systems that looked remarkably like what we'd now recognize as cult programming. In Cuba, a Spanish plantation operated what was officially called an agricultural school, but was actually an experimental facility testing various psychological techniques for breaking resistance. The network had even reached England, where a private asylum director was corresponding with Catherine about potentially applying her methods to patients from the colonies and the morally deficient poor. This wasn't isolated abuse. It was a systematic international program of psychological experimentation on enslaved people who had no legal protection, no voice, and no escape. The scope was staggering. Historians estimate that between 1820 and 1860, at least 3,000 enslaved children passed through these programs across multiple countries, with survival rates and long-term outcomes that remain largely unknown because records were deliberately destroyed or sealed. The network operated in plain sight, protected by laws that defined enslaved people as property without rights, justified by religious ideology that framed cruelty as salvation, and enabled by a medical establishment that provided scientific-sounding language for torture. Let's be real about why this story was buried for over a century and why it remains largely unknown even now. The conspiracy of silence around Thornhill and the broader network of psychological experimentation on enslaved people wasn't a coordinated cover-up. It was something more insidious, a collective decision by everyone involved that some truths were too dangerous to acknowledge. For slaveholders, admitting that enslaved people could be psychologically damaged by slavery meant acknowledging their humanity and the systematic harm being inflicted, which undermined the entire justification for the institution. For abolitionists, the specific horror of psychological torture of children was almost too dark to use in their arguments. It risked seeming like exaggeration or propaganda even when documented. For the medical establishment, acknowledging these experiments meant confronting their own complicity and providing theoretical frameworks that enabled torture. For the legal system, prosecuting cases like Thornhill would require recognizing enslaved people as legal persons capable of bearing witness, which threatened foundational assumptions about property rights. And for Charleston society specifically, the Thornhill case exposed how many respected families were either directly involved or willingly blind to atrocities happening in their social circle. So after the raid and the brief scandal it created, the powerful came together with remarkable efficiency. Records were sealed to protect the dignity of the victims, a noble-sounding excuse that actually protected perpetrators. Witnesses were discredited, paid off, or threatened into silence. The medical journals that had published some of this experimental work quietly stopped referencing it. Church leaders who'd provided theological cover distanced themselves without actually condemning what had been done, and newspapers, owned and operated by the same class that owned plantations, simply stopped covering the story after a few brief mentions that framed it as an aberration, an unfortunate excess, rather than a systematic practice. By 1855, it was as if Thornhill had never happened. Textbooks written decades later about plantation life made no mention of psychological experimentation. Histories of slavery focused on physical brutality, which was undeniable, while ignoring the more complex horrors of systematic psychological torture. And descendants of the families involved inherited whitewashed histories that portrayed their ancestors as flawed, perhaps, but not as the architects of deliberate, calculated evil. The outcomes for everyone involved reveal exactly how justice worked, or didn't, in 1850s South Carolina. Colonel Marcus Thornhill was never criminally charged. He paid a modest fine for improper plantation management and was required to submit to quarterly inspections for 2 years, inspections that found nothing because he destroyed all evidence and sent the remaining program children to other locations before authorities arrived. He sold Thornhill Plantation in 1855 for a substantial profit, moved to Savannah, and lived comfortably until his death from pneumonia in 1867, never once publicly acknowledging what he'd done. Catherine Thornhill was briefly committed to a private sanitarium in 1854 for nervous exhaustion, a face-saving diagnosis that removed her from public scrutiny during the scandal. She was released after 6 months, rejoined her husband in Savannah, and according to family letters, never expressed remorse, only anger at being misunderstood. She died in 1871, surrounded by family who spoke at her funeral about her charitable nature and her devotion to Christian service. Reverend Ashford was defrocked but never prosecuted. He moved to Texas, changed his name to Thomas Ashley, and continued working as an itinerant preacher until his death in 1860, shot by a frontier mob for reasons unrelated to his past, a random violence that was, in its way, more justice than the legal system ever provided. Isaiah Freeman was freed in 1855 as part of a quiet settlement to prevent him from testifying publicly. He lived in Charleston's free black community, working as a blacksmith, and gave one interview to a northern abolitionist newspaper in 1858, but his account was so specific and disturbing that the paper chose not to publish it, fearing it would seem like propaganda. He died in 1879, his journals and documentation lost or destroyed. And Grace, the girl who wrote "To Death, Omens and Ashes," who survived psychological torture and transformed it into a weapon, who briefly seized power through sheer force of observation and will, her fate is the most haunting of all. She disappeared from all official records after May 1853. Some accounts suggest she was sold to a plantation in Texas. Others claim she was institutionalized. One unverified story, preserved in oral history among Charleston's black community, says she lived into the 1890s, working quietly as a midwife and healer, still speaking rarely, still seeing things others didn't. Her real name, her survival, her life after Thornhill, all of it was erased by a system that needed her to not exist, to not be evidence of what slavery could do to a human mind when combined with systematic psychological torture. The legacy of Thornhill Plantation and the network it represented isn't just historical, it's foundational to understanding American psychology, trauma, and the long-term impact of systematic dehumanization. Modern psychologists studying the case files that eventually emerged in the 1990s recognized in Catherine Thornhill's methods the precursors to techniques later used in cult programming, political prisoner interrogation, and psychological torture. The isolation, the sensory deprivation, the systematic breaking and rebuilding of personality. These weren't invented in the 20th century. They were refined in the darkness of plantation cellars on the bodies of enslaved children. The moral of this story isn't simple or comfortable. It's not justice prevailed because it didn't. It's not good triumphed over evil because the evil was so thoroughly protected that it barely faced consequences. The moral, if there is one, is this: systematic oppression doesn't just damage bodies, it warps minds, both the oppressed and the oppressor. Grace became a weapon because she was systematically tortured into hypervigilance and pattern recognition. The Thornhills became monsters because a system that defined people as property inevitably transforms those who hold power into sadists who can justify anything. And society became complicit because acknowledging the full horror of what was happening would have required dismantling the entire structure of power, wealth, and racial hierarchy that everyone benefited from. The legacy also lives in what we don't teach. How many people learn about the psychological dimensions of slavery in school? How often do we discuss the long-term trauma that passes through generations? The way systematic dehumanization rewires how people think, feel, and relate to power. Thornhill should be taught alongside any discussion of American history, not as an aberration, but as an example of what happens when humans are given absolute power over other humans and a legal system that refuses to recognize certain people as human at all. What Grace represented, a victim who became powerful through understanding her oppressors better than they understood themselves, is deeply uncomfortable for everyone because it suggests that the powerless are often more aware, more intelligent, and more strategic than the systems that try to break them. That's a truth that challenges fundamental assumptions about power, intelligence, and who deserves to be heard. Could something like this happen today? Would we even see it coming? Before you dismiss this as ancient history, consider that the structures enabling Thornhill still exist. Systems that define certain people as less human. Institutions that protect the powerful from accountability, and collective willingness to look away from suffering when acknowledging it would be inconvenient. The methods Catherine Thornhill used are now recognized as psychological torture, yet variations are still applied in immigration detention facilities, juvenile prisons, and psychiatric institutions where vulnerable people have limited legal protection. The conspiracy of silence still operates whenever abuse survivors are disbelieved, whenever documentation is sealed to protect privacy, whenever we collectively decide that some truths are too uncomfortable to face. I want you to do 3 things right now. First, Comment below. Have you ever heard this story before? Has this ever been taught in your school or community? Because the erasure of stories like Grace's is ongoing, and acknowledging that erasure is the first step toward preventing its continuation. Second, subscribe to Echoes of Truth and turn on notifications, because in the next episode, we're uncovering the story of the Underground Railroad station that operated inside a courthouse basement, protected by a judge who sentenced runaways by day and smuggled them to freedom at night. A story so contradictory and unsettling that it challenges everything you think you know about heroes and villains in American history. And third, share this video, not because it's easy to watch, but because the stories that make us uncomfortable are the ones we most need to tell. Grace wrote Death Omens in Ashes not because she could see the future, but because she'd learned to read the present with absolute clarity. The question you need to ask yours, Elf, is, what are you not seeing right now? What horrors are happening in plain sight that we're collectively deciding not to notice? Grace survived by becoming more aware than her captors. We honor her by trying to do the same. Until next time, keep questioning, keep investigating, and remember, the truth echoes longest when spoken in darkness.